I'd like to call our hearing to order. Need to start off by congratulating Mr. Murphy and the Democrat members on their victory at the baseball game last night, even though there were many questionable umpire calls that we certainly would like to have reviewed. I would like to thank our witnesses for taking time out of your busy schedules to appear before our committee to discuss a topic that was all but unimaginable just a few short years ago. For decades, the consensus among geologists, energy producers, and policymakers was that oil production in the United States was in permanent and irreversible decline. However, advances in new technologies and the adaptation of old technologies for new purposes have now made it economical to produce enormous quantities of oil and natural gas in the United States, which has substantially increased the volume of our nation's proven reserves of oil and gas. The potential benefits of this new domestic energy paradigm to small businesses and the broader economy are significant. As the subcommittee has previously examined, the full upstream development of our nation's oil and gas resources could produce more than 1.4 million direct and indirect energy sector jobs and another 1.4 million jobs outside the oil and gas industry. Many of these energy production and associated manufacturing jobs will be created by small businesses. Of course, these jobs will only materialize if the United States responsibly utilizes the abundant resources it has at its disposal. Unfortunately, that is presently not the case. In previous hearings, the committee has examined upstream challenges to realizing America's full energy potential, predominantly those created by government regulations and bureaucratic inertia. These upstream impediments include policies that have made it difficult to obtain access and permits to drill for oil on federal lands. However, it now appears that additional challenges are emerging further downstream that could likewise reduce the potential production of oil in the United States and jeopardize the new jobs and other economic benefits that would result from that production. Specifically, there is growing mismatch between the increasing amount of light sweet grade crude being produced in the United States and the available utilization capacity of the midstream and downstream refining sector to process this grade of crude into high-value products such as transportation fuels. The reason for this are many, but they include previous assumptions that the United States would import most of the oil it consumed, and those imports are different grades of oil than what the U.S. is producing today. There are also regulatory requirements and other burdens that make it difficult to significantly expand refining capacity in the United States. The solutions to these challenges are complex. They are not only including building up the refining capacity, but may also include ending our nation's de facto ban on petroleum exports, which proponents proclaim would address downstream challenges to upstream oil production and help facilitate a reduction in the price consumers pay at the pump for gasoline and other transportation fuels. In relation to the matter of oil exports, today's hearing couldn't be more timely. As members may know, according to reports, the Obama administration may soon approve licenses for 2 companies to export minimally produced petroleum condensates. Whether this significant step or an interim step in addressing the oil supply and refinery utilization challenges and what impacts it will have on domestic fuel prices is a question that I believe today's witnesses will help answer. I would now like to yield to Ranking Member Murphy for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you all for being here. Excuse my voice. It was a very exciting baseball game and got a little raspy last night. Today, America is producing more oil than we have in decades. In 2013, domestic oil production reached its highest level since 1989 and helped satisfy nearly half of America's oil demands. These developments in drilling are now leading to changes in the American refining industry. Over the last 10 years, refiners have faced several market challenges based on various factors. Because of changes in the U.S. market, refiners have had to confront possible long-term reductions in demand, and they responded by cutting costs, reducing capacity, and closing facilities. But now, new, cheaper crude oil is leading to the expansion of existing refineries and the reopening of many shuttered ones. After a period of refinery closings in several decades, after no new single large refinery had been built in the United States, a few new refineries are being planned or built in North Dakota, Texas, and Utah. These refineries and expansions that are scheduled to be completed over the next few years represent roughly $5 billion in investments in the refining industry. With new oil sources and types of crude, this industry must adapt to the changing market. These new conditions are growing our domestic refining capacity and making smaller refineries more competitive. Our hearing today will focus on how to make this industry more efficient by analyzing the strategic investment and operating choices by oil refineries in response to the changing market. We will also look at how these decisions affect downstream gas prices and small businesses. The refining industry is subject to environmental rules that are designed to increase energy efficiency and reduce energy production's impact on our climate. Standards for greenhouse gas emissions, Tier 3 rules, and renewable fuel standards all play a part in the planning necessary to small refiners and producers, but also serve a critical purpose in reaching our nation's environmental policy goals. I also look forward today to hearing about the ongoing debate surrounding the ban on domestic oil exports. Some experts claim that continuing the ban is critical for protecting American jobs, while others claim that lifting the ban could lower gas prices and help our economy. As we examine the policies to make oil production and the refining industry more efficient and that impact their business decisions, it is important to understand the potential effect that these changes have on small business energy consumers. A healthy economy requires a thriving small business sector, so we must ensure small firms continue benefiting from the recent developments in the energy industry. I thank the witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to your comments. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. If committee members have an opening statement prepared, I'd ask that they submit it for the record. I'd like to be able to take a moment to be able to explain our timing lights that are in front of you. The light will start out as green. When you have 1 minute left, it will turn to yellow. And then when it turns red, if you would summarize your comments, we'd appreciate it. We do have votes that are going to be coming up shortly, and so if we can kind of stay on schedule, it would be much appreciated. I'd like to begin with our first witness. I'd like to welcome Mr. Russell Smith. He serves as Executive President of Quantum Energy, a small business in the process of building 5 small-scale refineries in North Dakota. In addition to his experience in the energy industry, Mr. Smith has also worked in the technology, defense, and healthcare industries. Mr. Smith, thank you for taking the time to appear today, and please deliver your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Murphy, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to come before you today. Much appreciated. We'd like to discuss some issues that are important for small business, not only in the oil and gas industry, but also in the agricultural, retail, services, and mom-and-pop business community in the Williston Basin and the Bakken Shale Formation. Quantum Energy is here before you as a development stage company. We're currently in the capital acquisition process to build 5 21st century energy centers that will consist each of one 20,000 barrel per day microrefinery, a 100,000 barrel per day natural gas or NGL stripping facility, and a CO2 recapture capability for use in downhole recovery enhancement. As a development stage company, we've had to make some tough decisions in the early stages of our business planning processes. The toughest of these decisions was facing the reality that EPA emissions regulations have basically put a limit on the feedstock size of new refineries to avoid being classified as a major refinery. That threshold is required because the emissions, if you work backwards, limit us to 20,000 barrel per day. That's evidenced by the Montana-Dakota Resources new refinery currently being built near Dickinson, Montana. That refinery, when it comes online, will be later this year or early next year, will be the first greenfield refinery built in the United States since 1976, which is an important development and one we look forward to, in essence, copying the process that they went through. The economic model that drives our current business plan is built around a pressing need for local and regionally refined supplies of diesel fuel in the Williston Basin and a very pressing need for local and regionally refined propane in the upper Midwest and the northern Mountain West states. Both supply deficits have created distinctly higher prices for these essential commodities. The region currently has a daily need for over 55,000 barrels per day of diesel, a need which will grow over the coming 18 to 24 months to exceed 75,000 barrels per day. The region's sole legacy refinery meets only approximately 28,000 barrels per day of this need. This new micro-refinery outside of Dickinson will meet another 6,000 to 7,000 barrels per day. Our 5 21st century energy centers will, using the similar design to the Dickinson refinery, each produce 6,000 to 7,000 per day for an aggregate of 30 to 35,000 barrels per day of new diesel. In aggregate, that will then mean that these 7 refineries will be meeting 85 to 90% of the region's diesel requirements within the 24 to 36-month time frame. Likewise, our NGL stripping facilities will provide the opportunity for relief from skyrocketing propane prices in the greater region. Low and middle income families are struggling under the burden of these prices, particularly in rural areas where propane is the most common home heating fuel. We additionally believe that our NGL stripping facilities deliver a refined crude product that meets the language contained in the 1970s era rule that banned the export of non-refined crude from the lower 48. The language in that rule that comes the closest to providing a definition of refined crude surrounds crude that is passed through a distillation tower. Our NGL stripping facilities do utilize distillation towers and, as such, we believe meet that standard. As the production in the Bakken continues to ramp up from a current level near 1 million barrels per day to an anticipated 2 million barrels per day in the next 3 to 4 years, the domestic refining capacity, which is already struggling to handle the supply, may force a slowdown in production growth. This would be harmful to producers, the local economies, and the continued growth of good, well-paying jobs throughout the region. Therefore, in the absence of an abolition of the ban, we strongly feel that locally refined and NGL stripped crude made available to the export markets can play a vital role in alleviating any potential slowdown in the growth of Bakken production. In summary, local and regional refining capacity helps, 1, producers large and small through limiting impediments to both increased drilling and production while opening potential export markets in an age of a global economy. Number 2, local and regional economic development by reducing prices and increasing local and regional supplies of vital commodities such as diesel and propane. And 3rd, low and middle income families through provision of the above-mentioned benefits. Members of the committee, we thank you for the opportunity to appear before you and welcome any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I'd now like to introduce Kevin Book. He serves as Managing Director of Clearview Energy Partners, an economic analysis firm with expertise on energy issues. In addition to his work at Clearview, Mr. Book was appointed to serve at the Department of Energy's National Petroleum Council Advisory Committee. Mr. Book, thank you for being here, and we look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Tipton, Ranking Member Murphy, and distinguished members of the committee for inviting me to appear before you today. My name is Kevin Book, and I head the research team at Clearview Energy Partners, an independent firm headquartered here in Washington, D.C., that provides macro-level analyses to institutional investors and corporate strategic planners. My testimony today suggests that even as many Americans celebrate the renewed production of light sweet crude oil, current trends may be creating an unstable equilibrium. Shale oil production has been growing incredibly fast. Demand has been growing fast, too. Newfound U.S. volumes have gone to 3 principal outlets: increased refinery utilization, displacement of imported light sweet crude, and exports to Canada. In my written testimony, there's a picture, Figure 1, which shows the growth of shale oil supply relative to those 3 outlets, and it looks pretty balanced, but there are several caveats. First, petroleum refining is a manufacturing process that requires a certain amount of downtime to ensure safety and optimal performance. This limits the extent to which existing capacity can absorb incremental crude volumes without capacity expansions. Refiners have already ramped up their throughput considerably. Second, domestic production has already replaced nearly all of the volumes of light sweet crude previously imported into the East Coast and the Gulf of Mexico. Third, during the course of the last 2 decades, much of the U.S. refinery fleet was upgraded to process heavy sour crude that tends to yield a thicker cut of the middle distillates that earn a premium relative to other products such as gasoline. As the U.S. crude mix gets lighter and sweeter, U.S. producers must offer the nation's newly upgraded refiners discounts to encourage greater acquisition of a less suitable feedstock. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, many government agencies and private forecasters expect U.S. crude production to continue growing in the years ahead, likely exhausting import substitution here in the U.S. and eventually in Canada, and outgrowing the ability of U.S. and Canadian refineries to increase their runs without expansions or modifications. This creates the prospect that the U.S. could soon become saturated with light sweet crude, driving the price down here at home. Despite high global prices, widening discounts to global prices could discourage new upstream investment. Most producers plan their drilling programs 6 to 12 months ahead. But the smaller investments involved and faster completion of shale wells theoretically offer them the ability to change their drilling plans in the event that saturation leads to a sustained, atypical discount. My cursory examination of the correlation between West Texas Intermediate and Bakken prices and rig counts suggests somewhere between 4 and 8 months of skid marks between a price collapse and a production slowdown. It is no secret that shale oil has benefited producer states in the nation at large. A jobs multiplier may be responsible, meaning that states don't just realize direct economic benefits from upstream production activities, but also the benefits from activities indirectly associated with production, as well as the jobs induced by new income. Put another way, oil and gas production jobs may have disproportionate economic impact because of this multiplier. And it may be worth considering the extent to which a jobs multiplier could also work in reverse if saturation leads to a production slowdown. Current U.S. crude oil export prohibitions tend to favor refiners, especially low-complexity refiners that rely on light sweet crudes, by providing them with discounted feedstock relative to their global competitors. Trade statistics from the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis show that the combination of importing less petroleum of all kinds and exporting more refined products appears to be responsible for roughly $40 billion per quarter in combined trade benefit. It may be tempting to extrapolate from the status quo and conclude that continuing current policies might perpetuate these economic benefits, particularly if U.S. refiners add capacity. On the other hand, that may not be true for several reasons even without liberalized crude oil exports. Saturation could lead producers to pare back upstream investment. Alternatively, significant downstream capacity expansions could exert upward pressure on feedstock costs from the demand side. However they come about, higher costs could weaken the business case for new refining capacity. That said, even if U.S. crude prices rise, U.S. refiners appear likely to continue to enjoy lower process energy costs thanks to cheap natural gas, contributing to their overall competitive advantage. In conclusion, producers may be soon selling their crude at deeper discounts relative to global prices, while refiners must consider whether to commit capital to new infrastructure predicated in large part on these feedstock discounts. I believe that moving as quickly as possible towards a clear and durable policy decision regarding crude oil exports appears to be in the interest of all parties. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my prepared testimony. I look forward to any questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Mr. Book. I'd now like to introduce Jared Blung. He serves as President and CEO of Octane Energy, a small business that provides oil field services headquartered in Midland, Texas. Mr. Blung and his partners started their business last year and currently employ 12 workers. Mr. Blung, thank you for being here, and we look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Tipton, Ranking Member Murphy, members of the subcommittee. My name is Jared Blung, and I serve as Chief Executive Officer and President of Octane Energy, a Midland, Texas-based small business that provides oil field services to oil and gas exploration companies. It's an honor to address you today on the critical subject of crude oil exports and the downstream challenges facing small energy businesses. Today, I have the privilege of speaking to you not as a representative of a special interest group or research firm, but instead from the perspective of a small business owner from the heartland of the American energy industry. Real boots-on-the-ground perspective from a small business owner who could very well succeed or fail based on the policies you adopt. Octane Energy is truly a small business. Our company was founded in 2013 in response to the energy renaissance in our country and is experiencing. We have a staff of 12, of which 50% are veterans of the American forces, and we hope to double in size over the next 12 months. Our company is on the front lines of the energy resurgence. We see firsthand how this energy renaissance has positively impacted jobs, how it's created greater sustainability in a historically cyclical market, and how it's helping to achieve energy security for our country. But I also see unnecessary hurdles that could limit the opportunities for U.S. businesses. For instance, the 1970s-era policy banning oil exports is creating growing market distortions and needs to be revisited. This policy prevents our small business and others from growing as we otherwise could, prevents us from creating jobs as we otherwise could, and most importantly, prevents our country from being energy secure as it otherwise could. Let me explain how. First, I should state that our small business, like many other small businesses involved in the energy industry, is directly impacted by the rig count. That is, by the number of rigs that are actively drilling for oil and gas in the United States. The more rigs that are drilling in the United States, the more people I can employ as a general rule. In addition to simply adding numbers to our team of people, the quality of jobs is also very notable. As an example, in Octane's consulting practice, we can conceivably add up to 4 well site leaders per rig at a typical remuneration of $220,000 per year per team member. We also are in the process of establishing a drilling company, which will require up to 25 employees per rig, with an average annual pay of $76,000 per employee. Many of these folks we seek to employ are American veterans who possess small unit leadership skills and an intrinsic appreciation for teamwork, sweat, and rigid operating procedures that are crucial to exceeding mission objectives in the energy industry. Lifting the ban on oil exports would ensure sustainability of these well-paying jobs in our company and in companies around the industry. The same goes for catering companies that feed rig hands, restaurants in those communities nearby, for steel manufacturers that make drill pipe, for countless other businesses that take part in supporting energy exploration and production. Creating a sustainable increased rig count is directly tied to lifting the export ban and will facilitate Octane Energy's direct investment in the manufacturing of American-made rig fleet, which will also create secondary and tertiary job growth. The $12 to $15 million manufacturing investment for each Octane rig would create and sustain jobs in New York for the production of shale shakers, in Illinois for the manufacture of mud pumps, and various locations in Texas for drill pipe, automation, and iron, just to name a few. Current U.S. policy is artificially suppressing that very rig count, and thereby suppressing U.S. jobs, manufacturing investment, tax revenue, as well as oil and gas production, by a lot, as it turns out. If it's suppressed, we have reduced investment, which means fewer rigs. Fewer rigs means fewer rig hands and support services, fewer oil field service companies like Octane, and fewer people employed at well-paying jobs. So today on this Hill, America finds itself at a crossroads. Do we cap oil production or allow exports? At the time when unemployment sits at nearly 7% and first quarter GDP in negative territory, the energy sector has sustained and added jobs for millions of Americans, both directly and indirectly through energy production, service, and equipment companies. As an example, the unemployment rate in the Permian Basin is currently 2.3% and has been below 4% for the last half-decade. By supporting the export of domestically produced crude, U.S. lawmakers can counteract the national trends in the form of increased jobs, GDP, tax revenues, not to mention helping put veterans to work as they return from battle and transition to civilian life. I ask you to consider the course of our energy future. The world has changed significantly since the OPEC oil embargo and enactment of federal regulations in the 70s. Today, I ask you to take a stand for a fundamental principle, that the role of government is to enable its people and to remove unnecessary roadblocks that stand in the way of our national security and prosperity. Thanks for considering our views.
Thank you, Mr. Blung. And I'd now like to yield to Ranking Member Murphy for introduction of our next witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Greg Dotson, Vice President for Energy Policy at the Center for American Progress. For more than 18 years, he was the lead environmental and energy staffer to Representative Henry Waxman and top staffer on the House Energy and Commerce Committee and the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. Welcome, Mr. Dotson.
Chairman Tipton, Ranking Member Murphy, and members of the subcommittee, my name is Greg Dotson. I'm the Vice President for Energy Policy at the Center for American Progress. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today regarding the future of the oil industry. There's three main points I would like to make today. One is that U.S. oil production is up and is expected to increase, but this does not insulate the country from price shocks in the global oil market. Second, lifting the crude oil export ban could have negative economic and environmental impacts on the nation. And third, energy policy decisions should be made in a way that helps to mitigate the serious threat of climate change. I'm submitting a lengthier statement for the record, but because the crude oil export ban has been a topic that's come up repeatedly, I'll focus my oral testimony on that issue. For decades, oil in the U.S. has been characterized by ever-increasing demand and declining domestic production. We were relying more and more on imported oil, but this has changed in recent years. Since 2008, we've experienced a transformation in our oil markets. New tailpipe standards for cars and trucks are curbing pollution and bringing increasingly efficient vehicles to market, and our oil consumption is no longer on the rise. New technology and policy have unlocked additional oil supply. North Dakota is producing more oil than previously understood to be possible because of new drilling technology. Heavier and dirtier forms of oil, such as the Canadian tar sands, are being brought to market. North America is awash in oil for the time being. But this new oil supply doesn't ease the challenge of our nation's dependence on oil. Global demand for oil is still on the rise. Supply disruptions in far-flung areas of the world still impact the prices we pay here. Just look at what's happening due to the situation in Iraq. Oil is a global commodity, and absent unique regional market conditions, prices are generally set by the world market. Experiences in other countries show that price spikes are not prevented or mitigated by higher levels of domestic oil production. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office examined gasoline prices in Canada, the United States, and Japan over the last decade. CBO found that gasoline prices in those countries rose and fell in tandem with the world market. Even though Japan produced almost no oil, Canada was a net exporter, and the United States produced less than half of its own oil. More domestic supply did not protect Canadian consumers from price shocks. Some have cited a recent study by IHS to argue that lifting restrictions on oil exports will reduce global oil prices and save American consumers money through 2030. It would be prudent to approach this study with a good deal of caution. The IHS study essentially suggests that rather than reduce our dependence on oil, the United States should double down on our dependence on oil. The study is not on strong ground in making that recommendation, and I'd like to flag two points related to that. First, the study assumes that there's a vast domestic resource base that will support a massive increase in oil production for decades to come. This assumption differs from that of the U.S. Energy Information Administration's annual energy outlook for 2014. The EIA's reference case projection is a business-as-usual trend estimate, given known technology and technological and demographic trends. The reference case projects that domestic oil production will peak in 2019 and then begin to decline. That's a point that is very important to emphasize and one that I don't think you've heard earlier today. EIA suggests that there may be more oil, much more oil than that, but they also say there may be much less oil than that. And that's a huge uncertainty that should be resolved prior to taking rash action on the crude oil export ban. There's another aspect of the study that deserves further examination. The study assumes that the U.S. is able to boost oil production to such a degree that it decreases world oil prices significantly, and that American households are able to enjoy those reduced prices unabated through 2030. This assumption deserves serious scrutiny. The Congressional Budget Office has stated that even if the United States were to develop additional resources, this process would take years, and oil producers around the globe would likely respond by constraining their development, dampening the effects of increased production on prices. CBO stated, and I quote, "Increasing production of oil in the United States might not increase the world's oil supply substantially or lower the price of oil significantly." That means that even if increased domestic production could reduce oil prices, such price reductions could be short-lived, severely undermining the policy argument advanced by the IHS study. That's why we need to reduce our dependence on oil overall, not just from other countries. The less oil we use as a nation, the less impact we will feel from international disruptions in oil markets. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Mr. Dotson, for your testimony. We'll now move into the questioning phase, and I'd like to begin with Mr. Lichtmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dotson made some interesting remarks there. I was just kind of curious. I saw something the other day that we have like 800 years worth of oil that we've now found here in the United States. Is that correct? Can anybody answer that question?
I think
what the volume of a supply is that's known and anticipated to be able to be touched and tapped in the next 100 years?
Congressman, I'd be happy to expand on my remarks slightly.
Well, Mr. Dotson, everything you said in your, I wrote down the words could, may, might, maybe, could happen. I never heard anything definitive from you. I'm looking for somebody who can give me a definite answer on how much they think is underneath the ground here.
I can give you a different answer that isn't definite, which is that in the history of oil production, we've run out a bunch of times and it's never happened. And the reason is that our understanding of what can be economically produced from existing technology is always undercounting the success of our innovation and our ability to respond to price signals. We're in a pretty high-price environment right now. I don't think anyone's missing that point. And the innovation is going crazy. We're at the very beginning of our learning curve on formations where we have no idea of what the tails look like. I think it's reasonable to expect, based on history, we're going to see far more than we currently think we're going to get, not less.
Well, it would seem to be, to follow your line of thought, Mr. Book, I think that would, certainly undermine many of the arguments that Mr. Dotson make about concerns about production down the road, about prices. Production may decline. I don't know where that remark comes from, but all of the things I've seen is natural gas, coal, all the fossil fuels, including oil. There's more and more that's being found. And Mr. Book, you make the point that as we continue to develop new technologies and new ways of getting it out of the ground, it makes more of it available. We can go back to oil wells, if I'm not mistaken, and pull some oil back out of those wells and make them profitable again. I assume that that's still the case. I mean, I've been told this by many people in the business. I guess, Mr. Blung, you are in the business of putting these rigs together. I'm kind of curious, what does a rig cost to put up and then to operate? You said 25 people to run it. Was the actual physical structure rig, was it cost, and then how much capital does it take to operate the rig?
So capital expenditures for a drilling rig, at least of our design, and they vary obviously from company to company, and those range, generally speaking, from $12 to $25 million. For our design, we're looking at deploying from $12 to $15 million per unit.
So how much, whenever you decide that you want to drill, what is the anticipated amount of oil that you have to pull out of the ground to be able to make that thing work? So many barrels per day, per month?
So fortunately for us, we work for the companies that are extracting that oil from the ground, and we are the means to that extraction. So for us, the internal rate of return on that well is important from a sustainability standpoint for our company, because we want to continue working. So if our customers are realizing the quantity of oil that they want out of each wellbore, then it would make sense for us to continue on and sustain those jobs and that sort of thing.
One of the comments that you made, though, was that, I think I saw in your testimony here somewhere, I mean, I think you made a point as well with regards to being able to sort of turn these things off and on. I mean, you can do it over 3 or 4 months. You could ramp it up with a rig, and you could ramp it down. Is that possible? I mean, when you got the kind of investment out there, are you looking to be able to have that sort of flexibility, be able to move this around?
I don't recall that particular portion of my testimony.
Maybe I misunderstood what you were saying.
Yes, okay, sir. I'll speak in maybe a broader brush. In our opinion, the Permian is a really great case study for the first portion of your question that you addressed, and then this secondary part. We've been commercially producing oil in the Permian Basin for almost a century, and we continue to find new horizons to drill into, which makes our basin somewhat unique in the North American landscape and really the global drilling landscape for that matter. So ramping up and ramping down, I don't think is really the key question that we're asking our customers, that our customers are asking of us. It's the question more is, how can we delineate and develop this in almost a manufacturing environment where we gain efficiencies and thereby increasing their rates of return so they can continue to deploy rigs and capital into the field. That allows them to continue to produce. But the turning off and turning on, I wouldn't be able to speak to that with any level of conviction.
Well, I see my time is up, but I was kind of curious also about the numbers of refineries and how that may be a choke point for being able to access and produce and literally flood the world with oil and oil products. But I'm sure that the Chairman will get into that. I thank you for your time and your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Lichtmeyer. Now I'd like to turn to Mr. Schrader for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smith, just a little background. I'm not an oil man. The original ban set up in the 70s. Give a quick, why it was set up, what was the rationale, and why that may not be applicable right now, in your opinion.
To the best of my understanding, having been somewhat young at the time, the original rationale came out of the Arab oil embargo. I think that was the motivation for the act that was passed in 1975. It was an interesting piece of legislation in that rather than provide a legislative prescription for export of crude, it was essentially an authorization bill that gave the administration the authority to do a rulemaking. And the rulemaking is somewhat vague. I actually have with me a Congressional Research Service paper that looked into the history of the bill Mr. Schrader, and examine what definitions existed in the bill. And it's interesting that the language does not, of the rule that was issued, does not explicitly define refined crude. What it does define is crude, and that definition, I'll read it very quickly, sir. I think it's relevant. Crude oil is defined as a mixture of hydrocarbons that existed in liquid phase in underground reservoirs and remains liquid at atmospheric pressure after passing through surface separating facilities, and which has not been processed through a crude oil distillation tower. That's the only definition of crude, but by inference, one could say that refined crude would be something that had been passed through a distillation tower. That is a part of the process that's involved in our natural gas liquids or NGL stripping facilities. Okay. And I think that as that affects the ban itself, it also impacts some of the downstream refining issues that we've mentioned, because some of the issues, Mr.
Can I just stop?
Yes, sir.
I appreciate it. That's a very thorough explanation, most of which went over my head, but I'm sure my staff will explain it to me later. Mr. Dotson, would you comment also, your perspective also?
On the crude oil export ban?
Yes.
I think, essentially what we're seeing right now is a discussion that's happening within the oil industry. And the producers see that they can perhaps get a few additional dollars per barrel if they're able to bypass the domestic refining sector and export directly overseas. And I think from the refiners' perspective, they say, we've made hundreds of billions of dollars of investments in this refining infrastructure. We have good paying jobs today. We have skilled workers. Don't bypass us. In fact, the Congressional Research Service said that lifting the crude oil export ban could affect refinery operating margins, and they say, quote, may result in some refineries ceasing operations. So I think there's economic reasons to really take a very close look at this, and there's environmental reasons as well.
Mr. Blung, do you, they're just trying to get perspective here. Mr. Dotson's indicated there may be an opportunity for increased excess capacity, refining capacity right now. Your testimony seemed to indicate the opposite a little bit. Where are we on that, in your opinion?
We feel that the choke point, more than the refining sector, is really in the transmission sector still. Pipelines getting that crude oil, or rail cars for that matter, getting crude oil to market, wherever that market may be, most economically viable for that particular product in that particular basin. Contrasting Mr. Dotson's remarks, however, we have 10,000 operating companies or producers in the U.S. That we would consider as independents, and they have no stake in refineries. And so they're forced to essentially take a discount simply because they don't have the organizational wherewithal or financial structure to have that investment in a refinery. Whereas the super majors, as we call it in the industry, or the integrateds, have that access. And we feel like that's a disproportionate and maybe somewhat governmentally augmented advantage that's given to those integrated companies versus the small operators. They're really the ones driving this shale revolution.
Question, I guess a question for Mr. Blum, Mr. Book, and Mr. Smith is, from my standpoint, is, if we go ahead with increased oil gas production, there is a big concern by a lot of people in America, regardless of where you personally are on the issue, about greenhouse gas emissions. So how do we deal with that concern? The oil could be a great export opportunity, could maybe drive prices down worldwide. Maybe we have centuries of it. But how do we answer the concerns of folks about how do we keep that production from destroying our climate at the same time? Is that okay, Mr. Chairman? Ask those three guys.
I can speak to that.
One of the new technologies that's coming out, it is very cutting edge. It's one that we're strongly examining using in our microrefineries, Mr. Schrader, is a CO2 recapture capability. And there's a large market for that in downhole recovery enhancement. It was mentioned by the other member earlier, asking about reworking some of these old wells. This is a great opportunity to take that CO2 out of the emissions that are resultant from the refining process and basically go bury it in the ground. There's a market for doing that because you're helping rework old wells and enhance the production of existing wells. And so it's a get rid of it, get rid of the bad stuff in a really good way, and there's a market for it.
Mr. Book?
Thank you for the question. Generally speaking, producing hydrocarbons corresponds to greater amounts of greenhouse gases. That's a fact. But there are different ways of producing those hydrocarbons. More venting and flaring, more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Good operating practices here in the U.S. can make our crudes potentially more greenhouse or less greenhouse gas intensive than overseas crudes, which would mean that if we were to export and displace other production elsewhere, we might have small but significant over time differential results. Most of the impact really has to happen on the demand side. And ultimately, what you're seeing is that along the way, some of the interim steps include things like using carbon dioxide as a way to get more oil out of the ground and storing that carbon dioxide as a consequence of production in the geological formation. So there's small opportunities, but you wouldn't want to oversell it.
All right. And Mr. Blung.
I can speak to our company in the drilling, from the drilling perspective, really most efficiently, and that's, innovation has really started to impact the notion of greening up the oil patch, if I can use that term. Drilling companies like ours and many counterparts are looking at biofuel solutions where we're using that flare gas that's typically seen if you drive through the oil patch and see flares going about. You can recapture that energy and power drilling rigs, and which offsets an incredible diesel expenditure as far as just sheer consumption. Some other things that we're looking at implementing specifically is waste heat capture, using the organic Rankine cycle to generate fuel-free, emission-free electricity off of those biofuel motors, engines, generators, so that we're capturing more of that energy and putting it to good use, rather than it simply just being a waste product. So within the context of the drilling industry, those are just a couple of examples of what we're trying to do to deal with that more from an innovative perspective. And we see that if we lead out in that effort, that the production community will follow suit.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Schrader. Mr. Holzkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to be at this hearing and visit with gentlemen here that are talking about the restrictions on your business. I am a co-sponsor of the Bridenstine bill that was referenced earlier, because I believe we need to lift the restrictions to allow you to actually continue to do your business and actually create some more American jobs, which are in desperate need in many areas of the country. But I want to shift gears to a very specific topic, and I believe a specific threat to the industry, and that's the Endangered Species Act and the efforts by a number of environmental groups to use that to impact and shut down parts of your industry. In May, the lesser prairie chicken, which I understand is a very tasty bird, it was listed as threatened, and in my district in western Kansas, it's essentially shut down a number of operations, not just temporarily till the mating season is over, but we're hearing in many cases where drilling rigs are pulling out permanently, leases are going away, they're not happening because folks are not going to take that risk, because there's a $25,000 to $50,000 fine, not only for killing the bird, but if you would somehow impact the habitat, which is very undefined. But the truth is, with the lesser prairie chicken, and here's supposedly the historical habitat area, that also happens to match up with something called a drought. And ladies and gentlemen, until it rains, and I've tried to get this message across to the Fish and Wildlife Service, until it rains, you're not going to grow any habitat. And so we hopefully it'll start raining. But one thing I do want to note that the impact is because of the sue and settle strategy, in which environmental groups have sued, settled, basically out of court with the federal government, and cut a deal that could lead a listing of 250 new threatened or endangered species. And I know that after the lesser prairie chicken, the next one is the sage grouse, which will impact a lot of areas. But the reality is that folks in this industry are not going to take the risk of a $50,000 fine or going to jail for a bird they may never see or for a habitat that's undefined. But what we've seen, particularly with the sagebrush lizard, which is not in my area, and I think it might be in Mr. Blung's area, you had a voluntary conservation effort between the industry and was able to say, hey, we don't need that. We can take care of it ourselves without a Washington approach. So, Mr. Blung, I don't know if you have any background with the sagebrush lizard, but can you tell how your industry works together to do this in a voluntary manner to preserve and protect our species?
One of the things that we've seen in the Permian Basin in particular, which is really the epicenter of the North American energy renaissance now, is an unusual collaboration effort that has not historically been seen on that front. And I would be reckless to say that it was simply economically driven. I think the Permian Basin houses some of the most entrepreneurial and innovative people in the country, where opportunity exists, as we mentioned, to create jobs. But in light of that, we also see some of the finest stewards in North America in our basin. And if any of you have traveled there, it would appear to the eye that there's not a whole lot to be stewards of. We happen to live in a very flat North Chihuahuan desert with lots of mesquite scrub brush. So the fact that we're really taking the initiative to meet with regulators, not just simply in Washington, but in Austin and Santa Fe as well, which are the other areas that are affected by what we're doing or trying to do, I would say that operators, the service contractor community, both are really taking an aggressive initiative to say, listen, we can collaborate and work together because we all have a vested interest. We actually all live here. Water matters to us. Our surroundings matter to us. We're raising our children in this place. So why on earth would we be so haphazard with our home, our own backyard?
Well, I appreciate your efforts on that, and that's a great example where it can be done voluntarily and together with folks in the oil and gas industry as well as the ag industry, which I'm in as well. Mr. Book and Mr. Smith, any thoughts on this endangered species efforts, which I think are directly going to impact your industry?
Yes, sir. I think it's also interesting to note that a number of the new technologies that are coming out, things such as I mentioned before, like CO2 capture, much more responsible drilling practices than, say, you would have seen even 15, 20, 30 years ago, pose far less of a threat to birds than wind farms, for which the Obama administration has recently issued an exemption from the Raptor Act to allow for wind farms to slaughter as many eagles and hawks and owls as they want, while you or I, if we shot one on our ranch, would go to federal prison.
Absolutely. Mr. Book?
Yeah, I think that's that Mr. Smith made perhaps the most important point, which is that the operating practices have become decreasingly invasive to the habitat of species, whether they be endangered, threatened, or just out there. You're seeing less surface impact in drilling operations now. And I think it's safe to say that also what Mr. Blung pointed out is very true. There's an incentive for companies to become able stewards of their operating environments. And there are histories here. The sage grouse was managed locally sufficiently that it was deemed to be maybe at risk, but still just a candidate. There are good stories, there are good news stories in the history of species management and oil production alongside it.
Yeah, those are great to see. And your point, Mr. Blung, if I might, Mr. Chairman, one last thing, the idea that the folks closest that actually live there actually know a little bit more than some lawyers in a courtroom somewhere, I don't know where it was at, to make a decision about what's happens in your area or my home area. We're working hard, but until it rains in my area significantly, it doesn't matter. You're not going to grow anything, and I just can't get the lawyers and the bureaucrats to understand that. So I appreciate you shedding some light on that. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Holzkamp. Now recognize Ranking Member Murphy for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. From my understanding, it sounds like some companies are finding ways around the restrictions to export crude oil. Can any of you explain how this is happening and what it means for the smaller competing refineries that are actually following the rules? Go just in order, Mr. Smith, go ahead, or whoever wants to answer it.
Yes, I'm not really aware of any individual companies that are specifically getting around the ban, Mr. Murphy. What some companies are doing is developing splitter refineries, which do partially refine the crude. And again, in response to the member's question about the export ban, it is that distillation process that occurs in a splitter refinery. So you are actually taking different components of the crude off the crude, if you will. Lighter components, they're often more volatile than the heavier components. And their position is that, and as is our position, sir, that is exportable crude and falls under the definitions of the rule that was promulgated after the 1975 Act. Yesterday, the administration announced that they were going to offer an exemption for certain condensates. We do not yet know specifically whether those are lease condensates or plant condensates or a combination thereof. Those are different processes that result in those condensates. But our position would also be that that exception to the ban was a valid exception under the language in the rule.
Does anybody want to add anything?
Well, the part of the problem in answering the question, Congressman, is that we don't know what BIS actually did other than what we can read in the newspapers. Simply put, what seems to have occurred is that a subset of the oil being produced from shale formations is being processed in a fashion that BIS has deemed acceptable for export once the processing is complete. So that's a subset of a subset, and it's not necessarily a very big change, but there's a lot of question about where the line might be. I know yesterday I spent a lot of time on the phone with my clients who were trying to make sense of it too. But whether this compromises other refineries is entirely a question of the scale of its impact.
Okay.
If I may reword the question, Mr. Murphy, can you, or at least regurgitate the question, can we speak to several producers getting around the ban? Mm-hmm. I think what we've really seen more than anything else is American ingenuity in its finest working, and business folks understanding the context of the law and creating innovations, much like Mr. Smith's company has done, to facilitate continued growth. I certainly would say, from our perspective, not that we're legal experts by any stretch, but it seems like they've taken what is written in the law and understood that well and are trying to play within the confines of those rules, but innovatively and creatively as they can.
Just as a follow-up, it was recently reported that the Obama administration approved recently the export of unrefined oil, and that was the first time in, I guess, nearly 4 decades. How does that affect your business plan and other, I guess, any of your industries and that of the refining industry?
Based on all the reports that we've read really in the last 24-plus hours, I think it's too early for us to tell, really. I think we're trying to interpret what exactly has taken place and what the impacts would be on our clients and our businesses.
That's votes, so we're going to run out of time here. Just real quick, I want to kind of switch gears a little bit. This is the Small Business Committee. You sort of alluded earlier, I guess, Mr. Dotson, to the super majors and their prowess in the market. What can we do on this committee specifically? If there was one regulation, if there was one rule, if there was one thing we could do to help the small businesses enter the market, help you grow, help you expand, and help new startups, what would that be?
I think lifting this export ban is the place to start. It de-risks the investments of the producers, which de-risks the investments of drilling companies and consulting firms like ourselves and everyone else down the line. And so when the investment community sees that their investment is de-risked and has sustainability, which I think really is the conversation at hand today more than anything else, at that point in time, then we can create jobs and have direct investment into American manufacturing.
Mr. Booker Smith, you care to comment?
With respect to small businesses, we firmly believe that the development of increased refining capacity here onshore will benefit both small businesses in the areas where the refinery capacity is increased and also small businesses that live along the food chain that would potentially benefit from a lifting of the export ban.
I would have to say that the oil price drives the bus, and investment follows the price. And with that investment comes a series of those indirect and induced jobs, many of which are supplied by small businesses. And so what you want to do is keep the investment going. And you can do that with policy that is clear so that you can make investment decisions and count on what the future looks like. Opening up U.S. crude to the world should help keep that investment going.
Okay. Mr. Dotson, can you comment on that as well and maybe talk about some of the recent EPA regulations like Tier 3 and GHG and RFS rules and if that will hurt small operators and refining companies?
Sure. Just on the small business point, I would say that refining is such a capital-intensive sector, that having small businesses enter that sector and compete is a very unlikely proposition. As my co-panelists have said, production, though, we are seeing lots of small business activity there, and that's booming right now. And I don't know that there is, I would actually say I'm not sure that there is action necessary by Congress on that boom, because it is growing so quickly. In fact, you'll read press articles about how the industry is actually having problems identifying workers to participate, and they're growing so quickly. With regard to the environmental regulations, I would say 140 million people in the United States still live in areas in which there's more air pollution than is considered healthy. And so EPA's mission in implementing the Clean Air Act is to attempt to protect public health. They've finalized Tier 3. That's a set of emission standards for cars and trucks, and it also requires cleaner fuels to be produced. And it's really it's something that's great for the American people. It helps reduce illness, helps prevent asthma attacks, and it's also good for domestic manufacturing, because the one area that the United States has a manufacturing edge is in the manufacturing of emissions controls, and they celebrated this victory. They see this as something that is good for hundreds of manufacturing jobs, because they want us to continually push for cleaner technology so they can manufacture that technology and export it abroad.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. Mr. Book, it seems a little, and I think we can offer this to the entire panel here, it seems a little counterintuitive to say that lower prices for domestic oil are a bad thing. Could you explain to the committee the downsides and why lower domestic oil prices wouldn't reduce fuel prices?
Happy to do so, Mr. Chairman. As one of the other panelists pointed out, global supply and demand trends set the price of oil. And while you can actually influence the global price a little bit by adding to supply, most of what happens here in terms of the prices that we receive for gasoline at the pump, which is where consumers meet the oil industry face to face, that's determined by the global price, which has a lot to do with other things. What happens here is that folks, like the folks to my left and right, are making investments, and they're making investments, again, based on the environment that the oil price suggests. So if our oil price is for some reason artificially constrained from reaching global prices and is lower, firms will make that investment elsewhere. And that doesn't happen necessarily right away, nor is it obviously going to happen when prices are as high as they are now. But bring Libya back online, solve some of the problems in the world, and the global price falls, and that differential will really make a difference.
Great. Yeah, I think we tried setting prices in the Nixon administration. That didn't work out too well for us as a country at that time. Any other comments in regards to that?
Not to sound like a broken record here, but another issue that does impact gasoline prices specifically is refining capacity. And that's one of the areas that we've literally built our business plan around. And I might mention, we're not the only kids on the block. There are a number of other companies that have similar business plans for developing additional refining capacity onshore. And as goes increased refining capacity, will go lowered or stabilized gasoline prices at the pump.
Now, when we're talking about the micro refinery that you were looking at, Mr. Smith, does that have the potential to lower the prices? Propane's a big deal in our part of the world, out west.
Yes, sir. There are two components to the answer to that question. In our specific case, we are building the micro refineries to address local and regional diesel demand. The diesel prices in the region are extremely high compared to the other parts of the country. One of the reasons for that is they're hauling the crude oil to the coasts, refining it, and then hauling it back. The closest refinery to the Williston Basin would be in Denver, 600 miles away, and most of them are in the 12 to 1,700 mile distance in terms of your supply chain. For diesel, gasoline would follow as well. And so while we're primarily producing for the local and regional market, others are in other markets and would affect that. The second part of the answer is the natural gas stripping facilities specifically provide for an increased locally produced supply of light gases, specifically propanes, butanes, that can then be fractured into their various components and delivered more locally to the market, thereby driving down propane prices. I also live in the Mountain West, where propane is extremely expensive, and we feel that the closer to the consumer that you can place the refining, processing processes, the better for the consumer, the better for prices.
I do want to follow up a little bit on the refining end of this. You know, I remember 1972, I think we had the first Earth Day. The projections were we were going to run out of all of our fossil fuels, I think, by the 1990s at that particular point. I think we've had some great testimony that the technologies have improved. Mr. Blung, I embrace what you're saying. People that live there and work there, I've talked to people with dirt under their fingernails that work on these rigs, happen to love you're holding up your hand, you know, that actually love their families and love where they live and want to be able to do it right. But we haven't seen a major refinery built in this country now for, is it 40 years? Is that correct? 1976 was the last major, and the MDU Resources refinery outside of Dickinson that will open at the end of this year or the beginning of next will be the first greenfield startup refinery in nearly 40 years, sir, and we're hoping to be among the next after that. What kind of inhibited developing a new technology to be able to do it better? Was it government regulations? It's not so much a technology inhibition, sir, as it has been the really draconian lowering of the level of emissions allowed by the EPA down to 100. Cutoff is 100 tons per year of any gas or emission deemed to be a regulatable gas, and at 100 tons per year, the guys with the fat brains can calculate backwards, and they've determined that you cannot have a feedstock input to a refinery in excess of 20,000 barrels per day without exceeding that 100-ton threshold. Raising that threshold would greatly increase the odds of having larger refineries built.
Mr. Chairman, can I just add that it's true, while it's true that we haven't had major development of a new refinery, we have had consistent additions to capacity at existing refineries. So we've seen a great consolidation in the refining sector. In the last 14 years, we've added 1.4 million barrels per day of refining capacity. Today, we have almost 18 million barrels a day of refining capacity, which is at an all-time high. So
but that was geared towards not a light sweet crude, but a heavy crude?
A lot of the recent investments have tended to focus on the heavier crudes.
Right. Okay. I would like to follow up on Ranking Member Murphy's question because it is about small business, and heartening to me to hear about 12 employees wanting to be able to expand average $76,000 a year in wages that you're able to pay the folks. What is the potential impact on domestic fuel prices of this limited decision that we just saw come out of the Department of Commerce when it comes to completely lifting the de facto ban on oil exports?
I mean, the decision out of the Department of Commerce is not at all clear. But if it's just a subset of our crude, the impact on prices is probably imperceptible. The impact of a wholesale lifting of the current policy could be meaningful. It depends on how much crude ends up being induced by the opportunity to come to market. But if you think of it sort of in a static sense, every million barrels per day is roughly $10 off the global price of oil. And you can start to feel 10 to 15 cents at the pump when you get into that range.
With relationship to the job creation by a de facto lifting of the ban, we feel like that it's perhaps more sentimentally driven, which will ultimately drive the economics of the issue. But it's investors and operating companies, producers have got to have some reassurance that there's incentive for them to continue to innovate and continue to deploy capital to develop our nation's resources so that folks like us can create jobs alongside of them in cooperation.
Okay. Thank you. They have just called votes, but I do have one final question I'd like to ask Mr. Book. Could you explain some of the trade-offs involved in lifting the ban on crude oil exports, and would the economic benefits of this decision be a net plus for the economy and for small businesses?
in general, if you increase the upstream investment, you're going to benefit all businesses across the country. There's a number of very well-documented studies that show how it reaches outside the oil patch, but there were comments by this panel this morning that do the same thing. In terms of the trade-offs, there are currently, yes, some refiners that are benefiting from an artificially discounted crude oil price, and they would be probably somewhat undercut in their current profits if that price were to go up. But it's my testimony that that price could go up for other reasons, even without the exports. And even if that price went up, they would still have two principal advantages. One, they would be able to buy the crude net of transportation costs here in the U.S., which might give them some advantage based on their proximity to the crude. And second, they have low-cost natural gas as a process fuel, which in the fractions of a cent that make or break you in the refining business is a very big deal. We have significantly cheaper natural gas and are likely to continue to have it for many years to come.
And I think there's certainly something to be said for domestic energy security, given what we're seeing going on in the Middle East right now in particular, to be able to make sure that we have those resources to be able to create our jobs here locally and make sure we keep the lights on and the heat on during the winter months. So, gentlemen, I'd like to thank you all once again for taking the time to be able to be here and appearing before this committee. You've all provided valuable insight into how decisions in Washington affect small businesses operating in the real world. The shale oil and gas production revolution does hold promise to transform our economy and energy security, and at the same time, we should be mindful that they are one part of a broader, comprehensive, all-of-the-above strategy that includes utilization of all of our nation's available resources, including coal, hydropower, nuclear, and renewables. Certainly wanted to be able to recognize, we just had the 70th anniversary that we'd recognized on D-Day. The efforts that you've made with half of your employees, Mr. Blung, in terms of being veterans, come out with some great skills, and certainly think it's an appropriate thing for us to maybe have some legislation to make sure that we give access to those jobs for our veterans that are coming out of our service. So thank you for that. I would like to ask unanimous consent that members and the public have 5 legislative days to submit comments and materials into the hearing record. Hearing none, so ordered. The hearing is now adjourned, and thank you.